The UCP is hosting its annual general meeting in Red Deer this Friday and Saturday. A lot of policy ideas will be up for debate, along with the leadership review of Premier Danielle Smith. Now, joining us now to chit-chat a bit more about it is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, it sounds kind of unusual after winning a majority government that the party mandates reviews every 3 years, and this will be Danielle Smith's first one?
Yeah, it is a really weird situation. Leadership reviews are totally normal. Every party in the country goes through these, but normally you don't go through a leadership review after you've won a majority election. Obviously, the voters liked you. Why would caucus and party membership and whatnot turn around and evaluate them themselves? So it is a really strange situation, and the reason it's worked out like this is because the UCP's sort of governing rules say that there needs to be a review every 3 years. And so, of course, Danielle Smith became party leader in 2022. There was an election in 2023. This is sort of year three, so to speak. And so she has to go through it. Now, I don't think anyone really expects her to lose. This is not like the leadership review of Jason Kenney. There's no real indication of dissent within caucus. There are certainly some people within the party and the grassroots and some of the sort of quasi-organized activist groups that we've heard so much about that are upset with Danielle Smith for various reasons. But nobody seems to be nearly as organized as they were during the Kenney years. There's no like overwhelming issue that's really fired up members of the party that could lead them to offer a really tepid show of support for Danielle Smith. So I don't expect any surprises from that. What is I think probably relevant about it, certainly in the folks in the party that I've talked to over the past week or two, is that, to some extent, this is a distraction. The UCP is in government right now. Its legislative agenda is sort of underway as of this week. There are all sorts of other issues across Alberta that they presumably want to pivot towards and tackle: affordability, healthcare, housing, those sorts of things. And yet there's, this political imperative for the premier and her supporters to make sure that she survives this leadership review on the weekend, and not only survives it, because of course Jason Kenney technically survived it too with 51 or so percent of the vote, but also to survive it commandingly. So it's some of the folks I've talked to have said, oh, this is just a real distraction from the priorities that the party should be focused on. But come Monday, in theory, everyone's going to be pretty united behind the premier and ready to get back to work.
Now let's talk about some of the policies up for debate, including one calling for the end of net zero emissions. Now the government say, hey, it's important to recognize CO2. It's a building block for life and important for our plants. We need CO2 here.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different policy proposals that are up for debate. I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of them have to do with sort of social and cultural issues. There's bathroom use rules, more sort of pronoun use, parental rights sort of stuff. There is a lot of that circling around. There's a little bit of sort of bread and butter conservative policy ideas, for opposing the carbon tax. I mean, of course, like there's never going to be a United Conservative Party convention where there's a resolution in favor of a carbon tax. And the net zero one, as you mentioned, which is slightly unusual because of its focus on sort of, I guess, the benefits, you might say, of carbon dioxide, as opposed to the opposition to the net zero policy idea that the federal government has. So I think what is happening here is you have this, some of the things that I just mentioned, which is the economy, housing, affordability, potential income tax cut, things like that, that are sort of some of the bigger ideas that are out there that you are, or priority areas out there that you might think of as traditionally sort of small c conservative economic fiscal sort of issues. And then you have the convention, which has a lot of these social and cultural issues that are certainly part of the overall, conservative sort of policy handbook, but are also the things that really, really fire up a lot of members of the party's grassroots, especially a lot of the new members. I'm not talking about the people, who were maybe Wild Rosers 20 years ago or PC voters 20 years ago, but some of the new, really animated people who came in sort of during the pandemic and the years following. And part of the issue from some of the folks I've talked to is that is the stuff, the social cultural stuff that ends up making the headlines, is obviously stuff the NDP wants to hear about because they'd love to campaign on some of those conservative policies, or against those conservative policies, I should say. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see how that needle is threaded, I guess. What are going to be the ideas that sort of animate this government moving forward, as opposed to the ideas that are animating the party's base? Is there going to be a pivot to some of the more economic stuff, more fiscal stuff, or are we still going to see, as the party grassroots seems to prioritize, some of this more social cultural stuff in the months ahead? And I would posit that some of the social cultural stuff is going to be a harder sell for the UCP over the next few years, but it's going to be interesting to see how they weigh the both sides of that scale.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the social issues. What do you envision as some of the more hot button topics that will be discussed at the AGM?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say, right? Because it's not like there's a massive amount of disagreement within the UCP on some of these issues. I think some of the parental rights, some of the pronoun stuff that we've seen in the last couple of years, it has been a little bit controversial at the AGM, but not in the way that it's been controversial, say, more broadly. When the provincial government, or when Danielle Smith last January, I think it would have been, announced that there was going to be the pronoun policy in schools, there was going to be a restriction on some of the medical options available to transgender minors. Um, the NDP and some of the sort of activist community said, well, this is an attack on transgender people. This is going to put kids in danger, et cetera, et cetera. Now, at the UCP convention, you're not likely to hear that. You may hear a little bit of it, but you're not likely to hear that much of it. What you're more likely to hear in terms of how it's controversial in that room is, do we want to open ourselves up to an attack from the NDP on this? Is this the sort of thing that is going to win over voters in urban areas where we've lost a lot of ground in the last couple of years? I think the concerns on that front tend to be a little more tactical than they are, points of principle, let's say, that might animate some of the opponents to those policies. So I don't actually expect anything to be wildly controversial. Not internally. I certainly expect some of those to be controversial once these are broader public and the NDP get their eyes on them.
So maybe more the focus of the AGM will be on the economy, affordability, healthcare, education, some of the more broad topics, I guess, that are impacting a lot of Albertans as well. Now, Tyler, the Alberta government is also asking the federal court for a judicial review of Ottawa's decision around the exemption to the carbon tax of home heating oil. I know you and I've talked about this in the past. It largely impacts a lot of Atlantic Canada. But many of us here in the West don't use oil. We use natural gas, not just here in the West, but in central Canada as well.
Yeah, that's right. And so obviously the carbon tax is still on, the natural gas you use for heating. I suppose if you converted your home to home heating oil, you'd get an exemption, but I can't imagine that would be worth it for the, $40 a month you'd save. Um, yeah, so the basic argument is this. The idea is that the carbon tax, which was found constitutional by the Supreme Court, I think it's worth clarifying that it was supposed to be a matter of fairness. Instead of having a patchwork of environmental policies across the country, a patchwork of, say, carbon tax or cap and trade schemes across the country, the federal carbon tax was sort of a streamlining backstop standard that everywhere across the country was supposed to follow. By carving out this exemption for home heating oil, which is sort of a de facto exemption for Atlantic Canada because it's so overwhelmingly used there compared to the rest of the country, the Alberta government's basically going to argue that, look, this is no longer fair. This has been a discriminatory discriminatory, let's use that, policy that is deliberately targeting one part of the country while exempting another part of the country, potentially for sort of crass political reasons, because of course the Liberals have a lot of seats in Atlantic Canada and are hopeful of hanging on to them in the next election. So that's sort of the thrust of this. And of course, the carbon tax has not been popular in Alberta for a long time. Even the NDP has sort of come around on opposing it. But the one thing that I would flag on it that I also find notable is that Ned Nenshi, in his statement yesterday, said, well, does Danielle Smith not think that Pierre Poilievre is going to win the next federal election? Why would you spend all this money on a legal fight when the carbon tax is going to be gone in a year? Which I think is a worthwhile point to make. By the time the federal court does its judicial review of this, perhaps it goes to the Supreme Court. I mean, the possibility exists that we will have a new federal government before this court challenge is ever actually fully dealt with. So an interesting line of attack, I think, from Nenshi on that one, who of course is a new NDP leader and trying to make some waves here.
Now, Tyler, on Monday, the first bill of the legislative session was to update the Bill of Rights. Now, this is not a proper constitutional document, so it really has limited power, correct?
Yeah, it's sort of it's a statutory rights document. So it basically created or expanded on four rights. It's changing the idea of freedom of speech to freedom of expression, because of course you can have forms of expression that aren't, just verbal or written. It's expanding, in theory, firearms rights. It's protecting against unwanted medical procedures, whether that's vaccination or any other treatment, with, of course, the exception most likely of forced or involuntary treatment for drug addiction. And the last right that it's expanding that I'm completely
Property
blanking
rights.
on. Property rights. Thank you, Hal. There it is.
You're
Property
welcome,
rights.
yeah.
It'll also make it more difficult for the province to expropriate property. Um, so what could happen in any of these situations is the NDP could win the next election and say, well, we don't actually like that bit about medical treatment, and they could just amend it, as the UCP is doing right now. The NDP could amend it if they so wanted. If they lost a court case, the UCP could amend the statute. So they could amend the Bill of Rights, or they could amend the impugned legislation. So in that sense, it has slightly limited effect. Now, it does, however, have effect in the sense that a court could use the Bill of Rights to invalidate provincial legislation or put a stop to provincial actions. It will not in any way affect the federal government, which is really notable on the firearms front, because firearms law is primarily a matter of federal law. And it won't, of course, affect the private sector either. So it'll basically be government and some sort of government adjacent bodies. So perhaps universities, hospitals, the RCMP in Alberta, the police in Alberta, municipalities in Alberta. So it could have an effect, certainly, but it hasn't really been used. I mean, it's been on the books since 1972, 73. It has been used on occasion, but generally speaking, people who are fighting in court over civil liberties, they do tend to use the charter anyways. So it'll be very interesting to see if this actually becomes any more than a symbolic gesture. Is this going to become part of the sort of judicial battle kit, shall we say?
Alberta's Agriculture Minister R.J. Sigurdsson and Liberal MP Nathaniel Erskine Smith are fighting a little bit right now, Tyler, and it has something to do with Erskine Smith backing a private member's bill calling on the government to create a pandemic preparedness and prevention plan?
It's a really sort of confusing situation, actually. So yeah, there's this private member's bill that would call on the federal government to work in concert with the provincial governments to create a pandemic preparedness and prevention plan. Say that 10 times fast. It's a real mouthful. And it's in the Senate right now. And part of what this plan or proposal for a plan would do is try to, create some safety or additional safety or safeguards around sort of commercial food processing facilities. Now, R.J. Sigurdsson, the agriculture minister, said that this seems like a plan to sort of destroy Alberta's cattle and pork industry. Saying that they could shut down meat processing plants on a whim and things like that. And Erskine Smith says, well, no, this is a plan to create a plan. This is not setting out any specific thing that the government could do. So it's a sort of a strange war of the words, because it isn't a plan yet. It's a proposal for a plan with some ideas about how that plan should come into effect. But nevertheless, some of the ranchers and meat producers in the province are not happy about it, and Sigurdsson is clearly backing them. And Erskine Smith said he was sort of baffled by the whole thing. So, whatever the truth of the matter is in there, it is perhaps a matter more of trying to find fights to pick with the federal government and vice versa, than it is anything to do with the specifics of what's going on here.
Tyler, Premier Danielle Smith has warned that our province could be headed for a budget deficit. Now, didn't government officials say that Alberta would have a surplus heading into 2025?
Yeah, I think as recently as August, they were saying that at the end of what would it have been, third quarter fiscal update. It was going to be a small surplus all along, $367 million or something like that, and also largely a paper surplus, because I never really understood the paper surplus thing, but it sort of has to do with accounting books as opposed to sacks of gold in the treasury, I think. But the issue basically is the issue that every Alberta government has faced for like 40 years, which is that a lot of the revenue we get is from resource revenue. Resource royalties, I should say. Got that totally backwards. And the oil prices aren't doing quite as well as forecasted or hoped for. And so when they do the budget process, they try and guess low. They don't make their budget plans based on $100 barrel of oil. They hope for $100 barrels, but plan for a lot less than that. And those numbers have been not quite as good even as they had hoped. So that could make for a budgetary challenge coming up next year. Now, of course, they want to be seen as fiscally responsible heading towards the next election in 2027. They don't want to have to raise taxes. In fact, they have promised an income tax cut, which they have deferred because of the budgetary situation. So it could actually affect some of the UCP's promises, I think. And also, of course, going all the way back to some of the stuff we talked about right at the beginning about fiscal responsibility. I mean, there are still some old school wild rosers and old school PCers who want to see pretty strict fiscal discipline, surpluses every year, tax cuts, things like that. So it does put them in a bit of a sticky position. But of course, it's the position that any other party would be in as well at this point, I would imagine.
Naheed Nenshi still doesn't have a seat at the legislature, Tyler. Do we know when and where he's going to run for a seat? Will an NDP MLA potentially be stepping down in an NDP-friendly riding, perhaps maybe in Edmonton, where you are?
Well, that's normally how it would work. Yeah. In this case, normally someone, sort of sacrifices themselves in order for the leader to run in their riding, and they usually do try and pick a relatively safe riding. I mean, Naheed Nenshi is not about to run in Peace River to try and win a seat in the legislature. And so Premier Danielle Smith, who of course has this other by-election, the one in Lethbridge West, that she needs to call a date for, has sort of said, well, I want to do both of them at the same time because it costs money to run an election and it would save money if we could do them simultaneously and so on. And then she hasn't really bitten. So it's actually really not clear what's going on there. When Jagmeet Singh first became leader of the federal NDP, there was some argument that he should sort of try and stay out of the fray of the House because, it's not always the most edifying spectacle in question period and things like that. So there is the possibility that Nenshi is thinking the same thing. He can maybe remain outside, maybe remain aloof, try and build up his brand across Alberta before getting into the sort of cut and thrust of legislative politics. But of course, he's not in the legislature. He's not sitting there. He's not getting clips responding in the House and all those sorts of things. So it is an odd situation, and there's really no indication. And of course, the most likely thing, logical thing, would be for him to run in Calgary, because of course that's his hometown. That's where he was mayor. It's where, as far as I'm aware, anyways, he lives. But of course, it's also a higher risk area for him. He would, be at much less risk of losing, say, if he were to run in, say, Rachel Notley's riding if she stepped down. Which she may do, but she also has not given any indication that she will. So it's a big old shoulder shrug. We just don't really know at the moment what Nenshi is planning on doing, and maybe more to the point, also don't know what the tactical reasoning is behind that.
Only time will tell. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.